Good evening. A very warm welcome to you. I am Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm really pleased that you can be here this evening. This is definitely a very special evening. This program is supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I would also like to acknowledge General Society member Catherine Chadwick, who suggested our speaker this evening. The General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, artisans who represented 22 different trades. Today, our 234-year-old organization, in fact, we just turned 234 very recently on November 17th, continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John Mossman Lock Museum collection, which is upstairs and you're welcome to have a look at afterwards, the General Society Library, of course, of which you're in now, and finally, our lecture series, which is now nearly 200 years old, and of which, of course, tonight's program is part of. It is my huge pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Blanche Wiesen Cook, this evening, who is going to discuss Eleanor Roosevelt, Volume 3, The War Years and After, 1939 to 1962. Now, Blanche told me just before we started the program tonight that the 3 volumes, and I'm sure she's going to say more about this, have been the result of 30 years' work. Blanche Wiesen Cook is a distinguished professor of history at John Jay College and Graduate Center, City University of New York. In addition to her biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, her other books include The Declassified Eisenhower and Crystal Eastman on Woman and Revolution. And many of you may have seen her when she was featured on air in Ken Burns' recent documentary, The Roosevelts. It is now my great pleasure to introduce to you Blanche Wiesen Cook. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you, Catherine Chadwick, for getting me here, and thank you all for coming. I'm so moved to be here in this most esteemed and illustrious General Society. My father was a unionist. He would be so happy that I'm speaking here. He was a member of the Transport Workers Union. I went to all those strike meetings. We will strike and strike. Anyway, and Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, was a union member and a member of the Newspaper Guild and various. I think what I'd like to do is speak a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was, as Joe Lash, her great friend, said, infinite. There are so many stories about Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was such a great visionary and leader. Volume 3 really focuses on her efforts to save refugees, to help refugees, and her efforts to deal with the bitter segregation that dominated all politics for so very long, and certainly during FDR's presidency. But Eleanor Roosevelt really gave us another vision, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then open it up to you for conversation, for questions and answers and thoughts. When I was preparing for this moment today, I was really stunned to look over my notes at how every single issue of then is an issue for now. I mean, I don't know if you are on commondreams.org, but if you're not on commondreams.org, I tell my students they have to go on commondreams.org because it's the progressive collection of journalism from around the country and around the world. And just recently there's been an article on Common Dreams about how the Civil War hasn't ended. And, you know, here we are. That's about right. The Civil War hasn't ended. But it was even worse in the period of Eleanor Roosevelt's first ladyhood. And it was, let me just give you one example. In the process of doing my Eisenhower book, I was stunned to realize that blood plasma in the United States was segregated, black and white, Christian and Hebrew, from all through World War II and Korea. And it was Eisenhower who sent an executive order to his friend, the head of the Red Cross, General Al Grunzer, in 1958, and said, we're going to integrate blood. Blood is red all over. That's the end of segregated blood. And Al Grunzer wrote back saying, Ike, you can't do that. The South doesn't want integrated blood. And so Eisenhower wrote back and said, well, then the South won't get any blood. Done. Leadership. And there really, I always say my life was an accident because all I ever cared about until an accident was sports and music. I was a gymnast, and I had an accident. A boy at a big city varsity event put a barbell at the end of a mat as I came out of a triple flip, and that was the end of my competitions, and it was the end. I thought it was the end of my life, and I couldn't major in phys ed, and I had to major in something else. So I majored in history and political science and anthropology. After sports and music, everything I took was exciting. And then one thing led to another, and I became a journalist and a military historian. And then after one of my columns, the president of Doubleday called me up. It's a column on Eisenhower. And my column on Eisenhower was, all real conservatives should vote for George McGovern, the real heir to Eisenhower's foreign policy. And the president of Doubleday liked that and said, write a book on Eisenhower. And that book took me to Abilene, Kansas, which was a dry town, and you couldn't even get wine with dinner. So I became friends with the local sheriff, who had single malt in his, and he also had guns, and I like to shoot guns. So we had a lot of fun after. He was right across the street from the archive, Eisenhower's papers, and that's how I spent my time. And also reviewing books. And friends sent me books to review, and one of the books they sent me while I was working on Eisenhower was this really stupid book about Eleanor and Hick, which said these letters couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, was a saint and a mermaid, and there couldn't possibly be love between these women. And so I wrote a review saying, a cigar may not, pace Freud, a cigar may not always be a cigar, but the northeast corner of your mouth upon my lips is always the northeast corner. And so then folks started to say, well, why don't you write a book about Eleanor Roosevelt? And I said, no, I God has forgive me. I said, no, I can't do that. I'm a military historian. I do hard history. And, I thought that was true for a while. And then I called up my pal, Joe Lash, and I said to him, what's up with you not having Lorena Hickok in anything you've ever written about Eleanor Roosevelt? And he said, well, I hated her. Let's have dinner. And why I was friends with Joe Lash is he had blurred my Crystal Eastman book, which was published by Oxford University Press, saying this is a book that should stay in print forever. She was one of the founders of the ACLU. We need that book back in print now. And we'd become friends. And Joe Lash really had written all these splendid books about Eleanor Roosevelt. But to make a long story short, he said, well, why don't you have to do this? And he took me to Hyde Park, to the papers, and I saw that there was maybe a little story. Joe Lash was the good son, and anything Eleanor Roosevelt said, this is important to me, he dealt with. Anything she said, don't deal with that, he didn't deal with. And she said, I don't care about power. And he wrote, she didn't care about power. So then I knew I could write a little something. And I thought I could finish it. This was 1982. My Eisenhower book had just come out. I thought I could finish it by her centennial, 1984. But you see, I didn't quite make it. The first volume came out in 1992, and then the second in 1999, and now the third is out, and I am done. But as Joe Lash said, Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite, and the story is not quite done. There is so much more to deal with. How many people here are writers? A couple of writers in the room? Okay, I'll be saying some thoughts about books that really need to be written. Volume 3, The War Years and After, really deal with two issues, race and the failure to rescue. And Eleanor Roosevelt's commitment to one world, to the idea that we are all connected. And very recently, David Levering Lewis has published his wonderful biography of Wendell Wilkie. How many of you know Wendell Wilkie? I'm always surprised when I go places people have never heard of him. David Levering Lewis, who is the biographer of W.E.B. Du Bois and many other wonderful books, we were on a panel, and I said to David, he said, what's your next book? And I said, my next book is going to be Wendell Wilkie. And he said, no, it isn't. My next book is going to be Wendell Wilkie. And so we said, okay, we'll have a race. And he finished his book long before I finished volume 3, and he's done a splendid book on Wendell Wilkie. But why Wendell Wilkie is so important for this moment is he ran against FDR in 1940, and they became friends. And then FDR sent him on a round-the-world tour, where Wendell Wilkie had an epiphany. Everything that happens anywhere affects everybody, everywhere. We are all connected, one world. And then he wrote his famous book it was published in 1942, One World, and it really is a vision that we all need to take seriously. And I have to say, Eleanor Roosevelt not only took it seriously, but there are moments in her columns. And Eleanor Roosevelt is an extraordinary writer. She wrote a column every single day, 6 days a week, from 1936 until the month before her death. And she wrote about 29 books. And in her writings and in her speeches, there's also a book called Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of Radio. She had her own radio program. She had her own television program. You really get a sense of her vision. And the notion of one world is really clear throughout, beginning about 1938. She says, we are all connected. And we have to see the ways in which we are all connected if we are to avoid war, if we are to avoid strife. And she really has this vision of what the world needs. Before the United Nations years, before she's so responsible for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, long before that, she's clear that if everybody has work, if everybody has education, if everybody has dignity, there will not be strife. There will not be war. How can we set it up so that everybody has an excellent education? At one point, she said, well, in volume 2, I really deal with this when she goes to Arthurdale, where she's created a model community for, it was the poorest area for miners, people unemployed, people were living in caves and culverts, and she creates this extraordinary community. And she builds these extraordinary schools and does other really important things in Arthurdale. And Harold Ickes, the father of our Harold Ickes, writes to FDR, do you know what your wife is doing down there? She's spending money like a drunken sailor. And she's building houses with indoor plumbing, hot and cold running water, flush toilets. How horrible is that? And so Eleanor Roosevelt writes back when FDR says, well, what are you doing there? And she says, in matters of such simple dignity and decency, oh, he says, if she has her way, we won't be able to tell the rich from the poor. And Eleanor Roosevelt writes back and says, in matters of such simple dignity and decency, we should not have to tell the rich from the poor. Then she deals with these schools, and there's an effort to close these free public schools. And here we are in the citadel of a community that built for New York the first free public school. And Eleanor Roosevelt gives a talk in which she says, not only should we have these free public schools, but we should have integrated free public schools. And she gives a wonderful speech in which she says, and this is April 1934, very early, in which she says, let us be clear. We will all go ahead together, or we will all go down together. In another speech, she says, I can give you 100% literacy and full employment. How? 1 teacher, 5 students. How about that? Are there any teachers here where classroom size has gone from 10 or 15 okay now to 30, 40 okay? And we're also closing public schools all over the country. And I don't know if you've seen Vanity Fair on the DeVosses. Worth reading. Betsy DeVos, head of education, wants to close all the public schools. So Eleanor Roosevelt really is a wonderful guide for this moment. Let me just read, and then I'll open it up to, I want to read something that I think is particularly relevant for this moment. In 1940, FDR gave a great speech in which he said, we will have a liberal democracy, or we will return to the dark ages. And Eleanor Roosevelt, agreeing with that speech and also wanting to support him in his race against Wendell Wilkie, who she thought was terrible at the time. That's before they became friends. I should say there was a really interesting connection between FDR and Wilkie. by about 1943, FDR and Wilkie decided that they were going to run together under a new party, a liberal party, so that FDR would be free of the Dixiecrats who dominated the Democratic Party and kept him back, because it was Wilkie who insisted we have to push integration and we have to integrate the military. We can't go on this way. And FDR agreed with that, but they needed to do a new party. And then very suddenly in 1944, they couldn't do that because Wilkie died. And I wrote in some article that he died of much too much. He drank too much, he ate too much, he loved too much, and he died of multiple heart attacks one night of much too much. And David quotes my much too much. But that's what happened. So they didn't have that new liberal party. But Eleanor Roosevelt writes a book called The Moral Basis of Democracy to support FDR and FDR's vision in 1940. And it's a wonderful book, The Moral Basis of Democracy, in which she talks about not just the ideals of democracy, but the ways in which the US is an exemplar of democracy. The 130 million people who make up our great nation come from every nation on the globe. Asians, Africans, Europeans, Latin Americans truly make us the melting pot of the world. This is Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940. We now face almost an entire continent of vast resources, but we have allowed a situation to arise where many people are debased by poverty or the accident of race, and therefore have no stake in democracy, while others appeal to this old rule of the sacredness of property rights, to retain in the hands of a limited number the fruits of the labor of many. Today, issues of economic opportunity and security define our problems. It is often said that we are free, then sneeringly free to starve. That is not an amusement. Nobody can say the Indians or Negroes of this country are free. Racial prejudice enslaves and poverty enslaves. And then she goes on to say, political democracy requires economic democracy, while greed debases it. Either we make our economic system work for all of our people, or we will lose, essentially, the game. And we need a minimum standard of security, equality of opportunity for every child, an economic level of dignity below which no one is permitted to fall. But we have not yet discovered the economic secrets of full employment, and far too many are left with nothing to do and without the wherewithal for living. We have been too devoted, she concludes, with the gods of mammon. Should I repeat that? We have been too devoted to the gods of mammon. Greed. Humanity must rise above purely selfish interests and take responsibility for one another. Democracy involves social cooperation. We must build a social conscience and a sense of responsibility, a national purpose in which each individual sets a standard for good health, equal education, equal opportunity. And these opportunities involve every line of work of the hand and the heart and the head and we must perceive it as a goal of democracy, the well-being of all the people. So that is Eleanor Roosevelt in 1940. There was nothing modest about her proposal for democracy to work. She concludes, every individual needs to participate in the government. For the government to work, it must be responsive to the people. We must make that will and desire the result of education and material security. We must maintain a standard of living which makes it possible for the people really to want justice for all, rather than a hidden secret hope for privileges, because they cannot hope for justice. If we accomplish this, we have paved the way for the first hope for real peace the world has ever known. All people desire peace, but they are led to war because what is offered seems to be unjust. It's an incredible book, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1940. I'm going to skip a bit of what I was going to prepare because I do want to get to Eleanor Roosevelt at the United Nations. What did I do with the United Nations? Don't go away, it's right here. Before I do that, because Saudi Arabia is so much in the news and oil is so much in the news, I think a lot of people have written to me that they were surprised to know it was FDR who made the first deal with Saudi Arabia on the 25th of February, 1945. And let me just tell you a little bit about that deal, because it really is kind of amazing. FDR met with Ibn Saud, and they had a wonderful connection. They became very friendly and had a wonderful lunch. Ibn Saud, the deal was, let me just back up before the deal. In March 1938, the Standard Oil Company, which was renamed Aramco in 1944, had discovered vast oil deposits in Saudi Arabia. And it was these deposits that Britain was very interested in, and Britain had interests already in Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Bahrain. At this meeting, Ibn Saud and FDR made an extraordinary deal in which FDR said he hoped the door of Saudi Arabia would be open, not with monopoly by anyone, but free exchanges of the goods, of all goods and opportunities, so prosperity could circulate. And Ibn Saud agreed for long-range economic and political accords to open the open door. The next day, I'm skipping a lot, but I'll come back to the agreement. The next day, Ibn Saud met with Churchill. And I have a lot of sections, different sections on Churchill, because a lot of people just love Churchill, and there's a lot to love about Churchill. But a lot of people have reason to hate Churchill. And his attitude towards the people of India and the Bengal famine, which becomes really millions of people die unnecessarily because Churchill won't let the food in over the hump. And Eleanor Roosevelt does not like Churchill, so I've sort of emphasized her dislike for Churchill because I share it. The next day, Saud met with Churchill, where FDR had honored the king's Wahhabi religious beliefs and neither smoked nor drank alcohol in his presence. Churchill puffed in Ibn Saud's face and generally insulted him, whereupon subsequently Ibn Saud said, "I have never met the equal of the president in character, wisdom, gentility." The contrast between the president and Mr. Churchill is very great. Churchill speaks deviously, evades understanding, changes the subject to avoid commitment. The president seeks understanding. His effort is to make two minds meet, to dispel darkness and shed light. Ibn Saud told many that his meeting with FDR was the high point of my entire life. And ultimately, the agreement was regarding oil, military bases, and pipelines. He agreed to build a pipeline from Bahrain to the Mediterranean coast. He agreed to permit the U.S. Air Force to operate the air base it had built in Bahrain, and in 1946, he even accepted U.S. Geological Survey team to search the desert for water and minerals. And so that is the origin of this situation that we all know about so much more today. So now I will take us to the United Nations, where Eleanor Roosevelt in 1945, after FDR, and he makes this deal, by the way, in February 1945, and he dies on April 15th, 1945. So this is like 2 months before his passing. Let me just, I have a lot here that I'm not going to deal with, but Truman appoints Eleanor Roosevelt to the first UN committee, to the first UN delegation, and she is elected chair of a committee that is going to create a permanent, it's called the Permanent Commission on Human Rights. And her team is really an extraordinary team. The commission consists of John Humphrey, a Canadian international lawyer, Pen Chun Chang, P.C. Chang, a Chinese scholar, playwright, musician, leading diplomat, Lebanon's learned Dr. Charles Habib Malik, and Hansa Mehta, the only other woman on the delegation. By 1947, when René Casson, who had spent the war years in London as Charles de Gaulle's legal advisor, had lost more than 25 relatives in Nazi concentration camps. By 1947, René Casson and ER supported a Jewish homeland, while Dr. Malik emerged as a leader of the Arab League. Their ability to work together, to negotiate across all differences, made it possible to have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was with India's Hansa Mehta that the unfinished ethical agenda of our time was presented to the world. Hansa Mehta was president of the All India Women's Conference and a leader of the independence movement. She was the only other woman on the delegation and had a great influence on Eleanor Roosevelt. The initial first line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was, "All men are born free and equal in dignity and rights." And Hansa Mehta said, "Excuse me, Mrs. Roosevelt, if you say that, it will be all men and not women, as it is for so much of the world. And so the words were changed to all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And there were many other important contributions that Hans Meta contributed. One thing I should say before we close this part of our discussion is that at some point, to get the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I hope everybody goes online and Googles the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because it really is so important. And most of the world has ratified both the civil and political covenant and the economic and social covenant. The fact that there are two covenants was, for Eleanor Roosevelt, a great compromise to get the Senate not to simply veto interest in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which they were threatening to do, because the economic and social rights were considered commie, Soviet inspired. Everybody has the right to work. Everybody has the right to leisure and time off and education. And so to divide it up that way was a compromise. Bottom line, the US did not ratify the civil and political covenant until very late. Does anybody know when it was ratified? No, nobody ever does. Because it was ratified by George Herbert Walker Bush after the Soviet Union collapsed, just the civil and political covenant. And George Herbert Walker Bush said, okay, now that the Soviet Union is dead and gone, it's time for us to support the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the civil and political covenant, which is, very much like the US Bill of Rights, the right, free press, free speech, freedom to assemble, and so on. The US has never even had, and why you don't know about it is the Democrats don't want to give George Bush credit, and of course, the Republicans don't want any credit at all. Thank you very much. The economic, and I should say Jimmy Carter brought it up, and Jimmy Carter signed it, but he didn't bring it to the Senate for ratification and didn't push it, didn't promote it. The Economic and Social Rights Covenant, signed by about 120 of the 200 nations at the United Nations, there's not even been a conversation about the Economic and Social Rights Covenant. So there's still work to do if we want to go forward, and maybe in the future with all the new people who've just been elected, we can go forward, but here we are in this strange situation with so much more to do. And I think that's a good place to end, except I want to quote, just one quote. One of the things that really surprised me was towards the end of the 50s, Clare Boothe Luce became a real champion of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Clare, you all know who Clare Boothe Luce is. Okay, great journalist. Eleanor Roosevelt had been very mean to Clare Boothe Luce and had actually reviewed her play, The Women, meanly. And Eleanor Roosevelt had some problems with Time, Life, Fortune, which wasn't, it was independent, but, Henry Luce is sort of a Republican. And they hadn't been very friendly to Eleanor Roosevelt. But Clare Boothe Luce, who was always a woman of tremendously complex vision, and I always was a great fan of Clare Boothe Luce. We worked together on Bill Buckley's. We were co-panelists for several years on Bill Buckley's Firing Line. And at one point, she asked me to write her biography, but then she didn't like what I had written about her in my Eisenhower book, and then she didn't want me to write her biography. But the bottom line was, she really thought that Eleanor Roosevelt, who crossed class and race divides and built bridges and forged remarkable friendships, was among the world's best loved women. Clare Boothe Luce's words on Eleanor Roosevelt. For many reasons, she is the world's best loved women. No woman has ever so comforted the distressed or distressed the comfortable. And that feels like a good place to stop.
We'll be passing around the microphone, so wait for the mic to get to you before you ask your questions. Thank you.
Blanche, what was I supposed to do before the question? Just use the mic, sorry. I was thinking about the idea that you spent 30 years doing this book, and it's in 3 chapters. So presumably you started the project with this sense of what you thought Eleanor was. And in retrospect, did it change much? Because you learn so much as you go through it. And is the Eleanor Roosevelt in book 1 the same Eleanor in book 2 and book 3? Or have you evolved in your relationship to her, and therefore you write about her in some different way?
Thank you. That's a great question. It's really Eleanor Roosevelt's life and times. And I became really obsessed with things that people didn't deal with. And nobody had dealt with Hick. And nobody had dealt with, but Hick doesn't last that long. When I asked Joe why he didn't deal with Hick at all, he said because he hated her. And why he hated her was because she hated him. And he said she was a bigot and an anti-Semite. Well, it turns out she rather was. And Eleanor Roosevelt is a serial romantic. She gets involved with lots of people, not for very long. She's easily bored. So by their relationship, the intensity of their relationship lasts until about 35, 36. And then their friendship lasts forever. And Eleanor Roosevelt moves on. And so I just became fascinated by all the different relationships that she had. And Joe Lash is right. Eleanor Roosevelt isn't infinite. A friend gave me the Esther Lape papers, L-A-P-E. I'm spelling it because no one has ever written a biography of Esther Lape. And she really needs a biography. She was a brilliant scholar. She taught at Barnard and other universities. Her partner was Elizabeth Reed, a very famous attorney who wrote the textbook of international law used everywhere in all law schools, Harvard, Columbia, and so on, NYU. And her partner, Elizabeth Reed, becomes Eleanor Roosevelt's attorney and financial advisor. She dies, alas, in 1943. And Esther Lape is Eleanor Roosevelt's mentor, political mentor. They become friends in the 1920s, and, Esther Lape really understands the game, the political game, and she's in the political game. Her passion is health insurance, is what we now call single payer. And she promotes all the efforts to get the U.S. health care. It's supposed to be in the 1935 Social Security Act, but the AMA lobbies it to death. And then it comes up again when Eisenhower passes what becomes essentially Medicaid, Medicare. And he asks Eleanor Roosevelt and Esther Lape to come out of retirement and support him on his effort to get us what we then have, a health reinsurance policy, which is what we have. That's all we've ever gotten. And he gives the pen, he signs the bill for her good work to Esther Lape, who waves it in front of the reporters and says, now this represents just a puny little bone in the vertebrae of what I had in mind. And she fights for single payer until she dies at the age of 100 in 1982. And her life is filled with politics and organizations and great movements, and nobody's ever written about her. So that's one thing. And then Eleanor Roosevelt becomes great buddies with Bernard Baruch. And nobody has really dealt with that relationship. I mean, I deal with it, but I don't deal with it as fully as it needs to be dealt with. After FDR dies, Baruch takes over Eleanor Roosevelt's finances and is very helpful. And at one point, Eleanor Roosevelt writes to Esther Lape, have you heard? Bernie has proposed marriage. Isn't that controlling? So these are, there are surprises. Eleanor Roosevelt is filled with surprises. Earl Miller, the one thing my partner Clare, who's a playwright and a psychotherapist, disagree about is I've created a kind of, there's a picture of Earl Miller in each of the volumes. I mean, he's gorgeous, he has muscles, he's the one who gets her favorite horse, Dot. They go riding every day, they take camping trips, they swim about, and he's magnificent. And so my category for Earl Miller is why not? All of his papers have disappeared. So it's sort of interesting. Why have all of his papers disappeared? There's a rumor that the kids bought his papers and destroyed them, which makes it more, because we know Joe Lash saw the papers, and at some point he writes the letters between Eleanor and Earl Miller are as long and frequent as they are between me, meaning Joe Lash, and Hick. So how did those papers disappear? And why did those papers? So why not? But as one goes through this, and then the question of, here she is, a woman of, born of wealth. How did she get that way? How did she get that way to go around the country and around the world and say to people everywhere she went, everybody she went, tell me, what do you want? What do you need? And her commitment was to make things better for people in want, in need, in trouble. And at some point, I had 2 epiphanies about Eleanor Roosevelt. One, when she writes about sports. She writes about how the happiest day of her life, and she writes this, in 1960, 2 years before her death, after a life of great accomplishment, achievement, splendor. She writes, the happiest day of her life was the day she made the first team at field hockey at Allenswood School. And that really, gave me one epiphany. Eleanor Roosevelt liked sweaty, knockabout sports, and Eleanor Roosevelt was competitive. And once I understood that, I got a lot of things fell into place. After the first year in the White House, she writes to her pal Esther Lape, who's her closest confidant, I have earned, with my writings, more than FDR has earned as president. Competitive. And then her commitment to make things better for people in want, in need, in trouble. Pause. How come? And that really is a lot about her family. Her mother died when Eleanor Roosevelt was 8. She essentially turned her face to the wall. Her father died when she was 10. He was 34 years old, and he died of alcoholism. I mean, pause. How much do you have to drink to die at 34? You know, we're still here. And so that's the beginning of her commitment to make things better for people in want, in need, in trouble. So lots of surprises and ongoing issues. It didn't stop. Thank you for that question. Yes, in the back, and then over here. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Today is a significant day in United Nations history. In 1947, today was the day that they partitioned Israel. So I was wondering what Eleanor might have had to do with that, if anything.
In 1948.
47.
47, the 29th of November.
Yes.
I didn't know that. Eleanor Roosevelt goes to Israel, and she supports Israel. She supports B'nai B'rith. She thinks Israel is going to happen. She's very impressed with Golda Meir. They become friends. And Eleanor Roosevelt thinks Israel is just going to be a haven for Jewish refugees, but it's also going to be a center of peace, is what she believes. That doesn't quite happen, and Eleanor Roosevelt doesn't, she writes a lot about Israel in the early days after her visit, but she says, for there to be peace, there has to be agreement. There has to be agreement about what is Israel, and right now, she says, those agreements have not really happened. She had nothing specifically to do with the partition. Do you have more to add?
Thank you. What was Eleanor Roosevelt's position, privately and then publicly, about the United States' engagement in the war in Europe, obviously prior to Pearl Harbor?
She was, of course, very close to, Eleanor Roosevelt went to school in England, and her friends are in England, people she loves are in England. And when I said, you know, there are still books that need to be written, her great mentor, Marie Souvestre, who really encouraged Eleanor to be a writer, to think boldly, and to be independent. It's really Marie Souvestre, who's a fabulous woman if you are bilingual in French and English. Her papers are in England, but they are mostly in French. It's a great biography that needs to be written. She supports aid to England. Why the King and Queen? This is the Queen Mother, if you've been watching The Crown. It's the Queen Mother comes to the United States. There's that famous hot dog picnic. And the reason for the visit is to get the United States sympathetic to England so that the isolationists, the people who say this is not our war, this is not our business, will be overrun by folks who say, yes, England's survival is our business. And that's really her effort. Then she goes to England and, of course, reports from England during the Blitz. She's very brave and confronts disaster and writes very movingly about life in England during the Blitz. But she's absolutely committed to the US fighting Hitler from the beginning. And she, unlike FDR, I mean, there's this really hideous reality of, there's somebody named Breckinridge Long who's in charge of FDR's refugee policy and in charge of his State Department. And he doesn't want any refugees in the United States. Delay, 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 keep them out is his goal. There's one moment Varian Fry goes to Marseille and gets out to save about 1,800 of the, quote, best and the brightest refugees, including Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt and famous people who should be saved. But that's one little lapse. And the ship, the SS St. Louis, you all know about that hideous event. The ship is turned back, and Eleanor Roosevelt says, no, that is an atrocity. I'm not going to let that happen again. The next ship that lands everybody will be greeted as a visitor on my account. And the next ship in is the Kwanzaa, the SS Kwanzaa. And she arranges with her friends in the State Department to let about 800 people off the ship and be her guests, whereupon Breckinridge Long goes crazy, and he says to FDR, who's in charge here, me or your wife? And FDR ends Eleanor Roosevelt's efforts to save people. At some point, I said to Trude Lash, who is Gertrude von Adam Wenzel Pratt Lash, what's up with nobody giving you credit for the Varian Fry rescue operation? And she got very angry. This was on her deck in Martha's Vineyard, and she banged her fist on the table, and all the glasses went off. And she said, don't write that. And I said, well, I'm going to write that. Tell me what's the story. And she took a deep sigh and said, well, it was to protect her family. And at first I thought she meant her children, but then I realized that it wasn't to protect her 3 children by Elliot Pratt. It was to protect other members of her family. And then her children dumped 10 boxes of Trude's papers on my doorstep and told me it was she had 2 brothers who fought here and 2 brothers who fought in Germany, a mother who was such a Nazi she would never meet Joe Lash, and her family was very divided. So she didn't want credit for all that she did as one of the leading American Friends of German Freedom, which she chaired. And, you know, the efforts to get people, she and her husband, Elliot Pratt, went to Germany during the 1936 Olympics and brought out many of their friends who were threatened. She was editor of an anti-Nazi paper in 1932, and her paper was burned, her apartment was burned, her life was endangered, her friends were killed. She was then married to Elliot Pratt, and they came back to the U.S. And then she met Joe Lash in 1940, I guess, and they got married at the end of the war. And Eleanor Roosevelt got very involved. Part of the book is about Eleanor Roosevelt's involvement in their relationship. She encourages the divorce. Elliot Pratt, he writes to Trude when she says she wants a divorce, why on earth do you want a divorce? You have all the freedom in the world. And it's clear that Elliot Pratt, one of the richest, Pratt, one of the richest people in New York, had an open relationship And there was no reason for her to have a divorce. Anyway, but she gets a divorce, marries Joe. It's a fascinating story. And there's no biography. That's one that I think lots of writers should be eager to write, because it's an incredible life. And she died about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, recently. Yes. And then over here.
What is Eleanor Roosevelt's legacy? How is the world a different place, or how was the world a different place because she was who she was?
Well, I think the whole question of racial justice, Thurgood Marshall, who becomes Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, says that Eleanor Roosevelt was Lady Greatheart, and that she was the great force behind the civil rights movement. And it's really interesting to read Thurgood Marshall on Eleanor Roosevelt and her impact on the civil rights movement, that she gave the NAACP, she was a life member of the NAACP, and she gave young students in the civil rights movement great hope. And she continued to do that from the 1930s. There's new books on Pauli Murray and Eleanor Roosevelt. Pauli Murray was a young black student at the time. Yale has just named a dormitory for Pauli Murray, which I think is really cool. So Pauli Murray Eleanor Roosevelt called her a firebrand. She was a civil rights leader in the 50s and the 40s and 50s, and then, became a minister, became an attorney, and of course, a great poet and writer. So all of Pauli Murray's books are now have been reprinted, and there's a new biography. I think and when I was a student at Hunter, student body president, in 1961, I invited Eleanor Roosevelt to come speak at Roosevelt House. And she stirred us all up, and she said, wonderful things were happening in the South. Go south for freedom. So we took 2 buses and sat in North Carolina, and became part of the movement. SDS and SNCC emerged out of that, had a great impact, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a supporter of SDS and SNCC. So from the NAACP to SNCC, Eleanor Roosevelt is there, and then she turns all of that at the United Nations into her quest for a universal vision, Declaration of Human Rights. We can, all of us, get together, know each other, talk to each other. She had a motto: courage can be as contagious as fear. And we must speak to the people we think we do not like. We must speak to the people we disagree with, and we will be surprised. And she would do this. I mean, she would have dinners and opera tickets for the Soviet delegation. Well, she hated the communist ideas and the Soviet vision, but she became friends with the Soviet delegation, who enjoyed her dinners. She hadn't catered, she didn't cook, ever. And they particularly liked her choice for concerts and opera, and they could have vetoed a lot of the things that she was promoting, but they didn't. Sometimes they abstained. And they abstained on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but it would have been awful had they vetoed it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think the legacy is profound and ongoing. I mean, I think at this moment she is she's the opposite of the creature in the White House. And she had a brain as well, in my opinion. I teach policemen. They wear guns to class. So I say, in my opinion, 3 times. when I say controversial things.
Last question.
First of all, thank you so much for your 3 volumes that you've given us. And my question is, you've mentioned a lot of anecdotes and things like that that you couldn't cover in the book, but is there any particular aspect of Eleanor's life that you really wish you could have dug into more and covered it more in your books that you weren't able to?
No, I really did cover what I wanted to cover. There are things that I should have covered, like her wonderful work for the in New York City politics. She did really great anti-Tammany work, and a lot of local politicians said, "How could you not deal with that?" Well, I didn't care enough to deal with it, but it's really wonderful to see, you know. And then, but I think I really do deal with Eleanor Roosevelt's notion that what we have to do to make change is go door to door, block by block, and build movements. That's what it takes to make a difference. And she did that from the 1920s to the end of her life. You know, the Women's Democratic Clubs, which she helped organize, door to door, block by block, and then have our own newspapers and our own, you know, political analyses, so it's available. And that. Thank you. Thank you. So I'll just take this to the back.
No, we would like you to, could you remain with us a couple of
Yes.
minutes longer?
Yes.
Blanche, I want to thank you so much for that outstanding and eloquent presentation. And I felt the spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt lives on in your wonderful books and writing. So thank you very, very much. Really, thank you so much. We would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria A. Dangle.
Thank you. On behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to Blanche Wiesen Cook for Eleanor Roosevelt, Volume 3, The War Years and After, for her participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. So thank you so much. And we've also made you a lifetime member of the library, so we hope you'll come back many, many times. So thank you. Thank you.